Hello, Pingu. There's a very distant land where there's little to be seen but frozen wastes of ice and snow. It's called Antarctica, and on the chill Antarctic ice cap lives a young penguin whose name is Pingu. Yes, thank you, Pingu. Pingu lives with Mama and Papa in a warm and cosy house built entirely from blocks of snow and bricks of ice. One frosty day, Pingu, Mama and Papa had settled down to a penguin family's favourite meal of boiled fish, boiled potato and boiled green vegetables. Mama munched up her greens while Papa tucked into his fish, and Pingu made a start on his round white potatoes. The trouble was, each time he speared a potato with his fork, it would drop off the prongs, bounce onto his plate and roll about the table. Crossly, Pingu bashed his fork on the table until he'd almost flattened out its prongs. Now he'd made a scoop. Brilliant! One by one, Pingu proudly scooped up his potatoes onto his beak. But Papa thought he was just mucking about. He showed Pingu how a polite penguin pierces his potato with a fork and neatly raises it to his mouth. But then Papa's own potato dropped off his fork, bounced onto his plate and rolled about the table. Pingu laughed so much he needed a good gulp of his shark's fin juice. He grabbed his straw, but then he remembered it's much more fun to blow through your straw than to suck. Mama told him to stop mucking about this minute and eat up his halibut. Pingu did as he was told. He picked up the fish by its tail, popped the whole of the halibut into his beak and sucked hard until there was nothing left but a bare halibut-flavoured skeleton. Pingu dropped the bony remains onto his plate, jumped from his chair and dashed to his toy box. But he wasn't quick enough. Papa made Pingu come back to the table and eat up all his green vegetables. Pingu hated those boiled green vegetables. But then he had another idea. He would eat all his greens in one giant go. He grabbed his straw, stuck it into those horrid old greens and sucked them all up with one mighty suck. But he sucked so hard, his eyes spun round, his tummy turned over, and he just had to dash to the bathroom. He made straight for the toilet, popped his head over the rim, and out from his beak poured all those greens. After that, Pingu felt much better. And he whizzed over the floor to his toy box, jumped in and sorted through his toys. Bricks, boats and planes flew in all directions. Then Pingu found what he was looking for, a bouncy red rubber ball, and the pump to blow it up. He asked Papa to help him. And while Pingu licked all the ice off Mama's herring-flavoured ice lolly, Papa pumped up the rubber ball. At last, Pingu was ready for some fun. He dashed from the ice and snow house into the ice and snow outside. But just as he was about to kick off a thrilling game of football, a big wet drip dropped out of his nose, rolled down his beak and plopped into the snow. Pingu hurried back to Mama, who took out her biggest hanky and gave that nose a good hard blow. But when Pingu got back to where he'd left his ball, all he found was an empty patch of snow with a ball-shaped dent in it. Pingu was furious. He searched all round in the snow and all round his own house. And just then, a pair of particularly cheeky young penguins popped out from behind the house. and started playing with a red rubber ball. Yes, it was Pingu's red rubber ball, and Pingu was furious. As the two cheeky penguins threw and kicked the ball, Pingu leapt about between them, trying to catch it. Until with one mighty effort, he finally leapt high in the air and grabbed the ball. As Pingu raced back to the safety of his own ice and snow home, the two cheeky penguins pelted him with snow. Pingu was so cross, he bent over double and rudely waggled his tail at those penguins. Then he dashed inside his front door, only to find that all the air had gone from his red rubber ball. It was as flat as a red rubber pancake. Papa was sorry for Pingu and set about mending the ball, while Pingu sought out the safest place in the whole world. He jumped into Mama's arms. Mama stroked, patted and comforted her Pingu, then laid him in his favourite swinging hammock. Papa blew up the red rubber ball, round and bouncy once more, mended with sticking plaster. Pingu was happy again. Pingu delivers the mail. Far away, amidst the frozen snows of Antarctica, it's a great day in the life of a young penguin when his father first takes him out to help him in his work. So Pingu's ice and snow house was filled with excitement the morning Pingu was going to help his papa deliver the mail. Mama sang as she ironed the peak of Papa's post office hat, while Pingu ate as much breakfast as quickly as he could. Papa put on his post penguin's hat, and Pingu gulped down the last mouthful of cod liver marmalade on toast. Delicious. Then he waved goodbye to Mama and followed Papa from the ice and snow house. Together they strode towards the post office. They passed the house of Mrs. Pengsniff, their nosy neighbour. As usual, she was peering at them through her window. Papa greeted her politely. Pingu didn't. At the post office, Papa and Mr. Pengalope, the postmaster, greeted each other politely. Then Pingu and Mr. Pengalope greeted each other politely. Pingu put two parcels neatly onto the sledge. Well, that was a bit dull. So he flicked the next parcel over his head onto the sledge. Papa reminded Pingu that post penguins have to take great care with the mail. So Pingu placed the last parcel very carefully on the sledge. As soon as Papa had collected a pile of letters from Mr. Pengalope, he and Pingu set off on their round. At their first call, Pingu leapt off the sledge and grabbed a parcel. Papa put his post penguin's hat on Pingu's head. But it was 8 sizes too big, and the moment Pingu took a step, the hat slipped over his eyes. When Pingu straightened it, he looked almost like a real post penguin as he rang his first doorbell. Mr. Pengthwaite opened the door and asked Pingu what was in his parcel. Pingu didn't know, so he bounced the parcel up and down on the snow to find out. It bounced amazingly high, and Mr. Pengthwaite watched in horror as the wrapping fell off his parcel. But he was all smiles when he saw the parcel contained the bouncy orange ball he'd been expecting for weeks. Pingu left Mr. Pengthwaite bouncing happily. Papa had to deliver a letter to old Mr. Pendergrass. It must have been sad news, Tears were flooding from Mr. Pendergrass's eyes. Papa comforted him. Tears flooded from Pingu's eyes too, although he didn't really know why. But Papa comforted him anyway. Papa explained that Mr. Pendergrass's great-great-great-grandpapa had died. But Mr. Pendergrass would soon get over it, as he would now inherit his very own iceberg. Papa then sent Pingu off with a parcel for the next house. There was no reply, but Pingu had an idea. A window opened, and a rather cross penguin snatched the parcel from Pingu. A post penguin should not wake a gentleman so rudely, he said, and never while he's having an after-breakfast snooze. Pingu muttered grumpily as he went to collect the next parcel from Papa. To reach the next front door, Pingu had to struggle up a long flight of icy steps. Then he could ring the bell. The door was flung open slap into Pingu's face. The famous opera singer, Signor Pengarotti, stepped from his house. But Pingu was still hidden behind the door, so Signor Pengarotti stepped back into his house. Pingu fingered the bit of his beak which had been bumped by the door and tried again. This time he remembered to jump back as once again Signor Pengarotti flung open his door. And this time Pingu jumped out from behind the door and handed his parcel to Signor Pengarotti, who was most grateful. At their final call, Pingu decided not to risk being bumped by any more front doors, so he stood well back and announced himself in his own way. 3 baby penguins tumbled from the house, followed by their harassed mother. She was delighted to see the parcel Pingu was carrying. There was an ice lolly for each of her youngsters, an albatross-flavoured lolly, a walrus-flavoured lolly, and a whale blubber-flavoured lolly. That should keep them happy. By now, Pingu was worn out. It was time to return to the post office. Pingu had only started telling Mr. Pengalope, the postmaster, what a fine post penguin he'd been when Papa said it was time to go home. So off they went. Mama was delighted to see Pingu in the smart post penguin's hat, and Papa said he really had been rather a good post penguin. But it was the end of a hard day's work, and Pingu was exhausted. All a brand new post penguin wants at the end of a long day is a warm cuddle from his mama. And of course, that's just what Pingu got. Pingu looks after the egg. If you're a penguin and you want to keep your ice and snow home neat and tidy, there's always housework to be done. Everybody has to lend a wing, and one day, deep in the depths of the Antarctic, Pingu's papa was busy with the family wash. He opened the door of the washing machine and filled a basket with clothes and towels to be taken out to dry in the fresh air. Now, Pingu hated housework, and he was very quietly reading a comic and hoping his parents wouldn't notice him. Pingu's mama was helping Papa by doing some of his knitting. They were making yet another of those red woolly hats Pingu doesn't like wearing. When Papa was ready to hang the washing out on the line, Mama said she'd help him. But Papa told her not to rush, and he stepped out into the snow. Mama was taking life very easily just now. And the reason for that was the penguin family were expecting a new arrival. Yes, Mama was sitting on an egg, waiting for a tiny chick to hatch out. A brother or sister for Pingu. Mama wanted Pingu to sit on the egg for a while, and she was rather cross when he didn't answer. Then she realised he couldn't hear because Pingu was listening to a record through headphones. It was about time he did something useful about the place, thought Mama. She switched off the record player, put Pingu's headphones in the cupboard, and sent him across the room to where the egg nestled in its special hatching hole in the floor. Mama showed Pingu how you have to flick back your tail feathers and sit gently on the egg to keep it warm. Pingu didn't fancy this, but had a go anyway. As soon as he lowered himself onto the egg, which was nearly half the size of Pingu himself, he slid straight off. He thought that was a bit of a laugh, but Mama didn't. Again, she showed Pingu how to sit neatly on the egg. Again, Pingu tried. He stretched his legs as wide as he could and lowered himself onto the egg. He was most uncomfortable. But Mama patted his head and went to help Papa hang out the washing. Pingu was soon bored with sitting still, and he pottered over to the record player to listen to his record again. Pingu danced about the room to the music. And for a while, he didn't notice the egg. It started to move to the music as well. Then it grew 2 tiny feet, hopped from its hatching hole, and began to dance about. Pingu still took no notice, so the egg marched up and tapped him on the wing. The egg wanted to play. It dashed across the room, and Pingu chased after it. Then the egg danced about on the record player. Pingu tried to catch the egg in his fishing net, but it jumped straight past him and knocked over a chair. Out at the washing line, Mama and Papa were making plans for their new chick. Suddenly, lumps began to appear and disappear in the walls of their ice and snow house. Papa was astonished. Inside the house, Pingu and the egg were playing on a seesaw they'd made from a shelf and some books. And the extraordinary egg was bouncing up and down from the seesaw and on and off the walls and the ceiling and making lumps appear and disappear as it bounced. The whole place was in a terrible mess. Furniture upside down, pictures askew, wool trailing everywhere. Mama and Papa hurried to see what was going on in the house. Inside, Pingu jumped onto one end of the seesaw and, as Papa reached the front door, the egg shot from the other end up through the roof and down again. Just before the egg smashed onto the floor, Papa managed to catch it in Pingu's fishing net. Mama turned off the record. Now she was worried again. She couldn't see Pingu anywhere. But out he hopped from the cupboard under the record player. Mama swept Pingu up and cuddled him. Pingu kissed Mama, and Papa returned the egg to its hatching hole and settled down on it. Both Pingu's parents had forgotten to be angry about the mess in the house. Mama asked Pingu if he'd be kind enough to tidy up. And Pingu had a good time flicking the chairs upright, straightening the pictures, and turning the seesaw back into a bookshelf. Papa finished his knitting and presented Pingu with his new woolly hat. Pingu even remembered to thank him politely. The new arrival. When a penguin family is waiting for a new chick to arrive, it seems ages and ages before the precious egg hatches and the fluffy bundle of joy pops out. At least, that's how it seemed to Pingu while his family were waiting for their new arrival. Hour after hour, he sat around the ice and snow house reading his comics, waiting for something to happen. Mama worried whether the new chick would be healthy, and Papa, whose turn it was today to sit on the egg in its hatching hole, tried to keep her calm. But suddenly, Papa felt something move beneath his tail feathers. He jumped up, and sure enough, the egg was shifting about. Now Pingu was interested. Mama and Papa thought this could be it. Mama took a turn at the hatching hole. Could she feel anything? Wondered Papa. She could. She jumped up and together they watched the egg move about. Pingu stared in wonder as Papa returned to the egg and Mama looked on. Suddenly, the kettle heating on the stove started to whistle. Pingu dashed across the room to turn it off. But then the telephone began to ring, and Papa told him to hurry. It was all too much for Pingu. So Mama had to turn off the kettle and answer the telephone, before hurrying back to the hatching hole to see how Papa was getting on. But Papa was getting off. A sharp little beak had burst through the egg and stuck itself straight into Papa's bottom. There was a chick in that egg and it wanted to get out. This was the moment to call the nurse. Papa telephoned the Ice Cap Maternity Hospital. Nurse Pengagale was on her way. Pingu wanted to look out for her. He was standing on top of the ice and snow house when he saw a penguin in a nurse's uniform skiing over the snow. This was Nurse Pengagale. Pingu leant down and opened the front door so the nurse could ski straight into the house, where Mama was delighted to see her. Right away, the nurse opened her bag and got to work. The egg had now been placed on a warm blanket and the nurse listened to the shell through her stethoscope. Inside, all seemed to be well. By now, of course, nobody took the slightest notice of Pingu. He wanted to know what was happening, but the grown-ups just stared at the shell, until Papa finally told Pingu to sit down and be quiet. Pingu argued, but it was no good. It seemed Mama and Papa would only talk to Nurse Pengagale. And when Pingu tiptoed up to take a peek, Papa sent him back again. It was time for the nurse to produce her special medical teaspoon. With it, she tapped all around the shell of the egg. The nurse tapped and tapped, and Papa was getting nervous. So when Pingu sneaked up again, Papa was not at all pleased. The top of the eggshell cracked open, and out popped a pair of tiny orange feet. Mama and Papa could hear the voice of their new penguin as Nurse Pengagale peeled more shell from the egg. Pingu wanted to look too. All of a sudden, the grown-up stepped aside, and there on the blanket was a perfect fluffy chick. It was what they'd all wanted, a baby girl penguin. Pingu peered curiously at his new sister. But when he tried to have a chat with her, all she did was squirt some funny yellow stuff out of her bottom. Ugh! Pingu called the nurse. She soon cleared up the yellow stuff with a chick wipe. And then she cleaned up the chick and sent Pingu to the bathroom to throw the dirty chick wipe away. He was only too glad to flush it down the toilet. Mama thanked Nurse Pengagale for all her help as she skied off out of the house. Back on her blanket, the baby chick kicked her little feet and flapped her tiny wings as Mama watched proudly. Then Papa set up his camera as Mama gave the chick its first bottle of milk. Pingu hurried to join them. Papa stepped from the camera and stood beside his family as the camera whirred and a bright light flashed. And for all time, the penguin family would have that cherished photo of Mama and Papa with Pingu and their fluffy new chick, Pingu's sister, who they decided to call Pinga. Pingu goes fishing. On a crisp Antarctic morning, there's nothing a young penguin likes better than a spot of fishing. One particular crisp and fishy morning, Pingu set off with his fishing rod and bucket full of bait for his favourite fishing hole in the ice. Soon, he came to the edge of the high cliff, where he jumped aboard a handy lump of frozen snow and sledged down the winding, twisting, slippery slope, shot under an ice bridge, leapt over a snow bridge, and slithered to a halt on the ice below, just beside his favourite fishing hole. He was feeling a bit dizzy from his slide down the winding, twisting slope, but the moment his head stopped spinning, Pingu picked a handful of bait from his bucket. The bait was a special frosty moss the local fish just loved, and Pingu fixed it onto the hook at the end of his fishing line. Then, with a neat flick of his rod, he cast the line into the waters of the fishing hole and settled down to wait for his first catch. He didn't have to wait long. The fish really did love that frosty moss. With a cry of penguiny triumph, Pingu picked a fish from his hook and dropped it onto the ice behind him. Again, he fixed some bait onto his hook, and again he cast his line into the fishing hole. Now, just behind Pingu's bit of ice, there was another fishing hole. Out of it popped Seymour, the baby seal. He'd been watching Pingu catch his fish, and his mouth had watered at the sight of his bait. Seymour loved frosty moss too, and when he saw Pingu settle down to wait for his second fish, he had an idea. He slipped back into his own fishing hole, nipped under the ice, popped quietly up in Pingu's fishing hole, grabbed the hook with the mossy bait, and nipped back under the ice to his own fishing hole. As Pingu waited cheerfully for his second catch, Seymour flapped up onto the ice with Pingu's hook and tugged hard at the fishing line. Pingu thought he'd made a second catch. As Pingu pulled and heaved and strained at his line, Seymour took the bait from the hook and gobbled it up. Then he stuck Pingu's first fish back onto the hook and dropped it into the water. Now Pingu found it much easier to reel in his line and hauled from the water what he thought was his second fish. Pingu picked the fish from his hook and dropped it onto the ice behind him. Seymour watched as Pingu fixed another delicious lump of frosty moss onto his hook and cast it into his fishing hole. Again, the baby seal disappeared into the water. Pingu could hardly wait for his next fish, as again Seymour grabbed Pingu's hook, nipped back under the ice, flapped up from his own fishing hole and tugged at Pingu's line. But this time he tugged Pingu's fishing line a bit too hard and pulled Pingu into the water. As he leapt back onto the ice, Pingu actually saw Seymour munching his frosty moss bait. Pingu was furious. Seymour had been caught out. They splashed after each other in and out of the fishing holes. As Seymour disappeared down one of the holes, Pingu quickly blocked it up with a great big piece of ice. He'd set a trap for Seymour. He took a ball of string from his bucket and tied some frosty moss bait to one end. Then he took the other end and hid behind an icy rock. Now, when Seymour popped up from the other fishing hole, he just couldn't resist Pingu's bait. He flapped across the ice after it, as Pingu tugged the bait with his string. Seymour chased the sliding bait behind the icy rock. Pingu dashed out and slid another great piece of ice across the second fishing hole. Seymour was trapped. Pingu had triumphed. But of course, baby seals get frightened when they can't find water, and Seymour was desperate to dive back into one of those fishing holes. He began to cry. Pingu took pity on Seymour, and he began to cry as well. He pushed aside the great big pieces of ice. And with a happy cry, Seymour leapt into the water. He was so grateful to Pingu, he caught him the hugest fish the little penguin had ever seen. Pingu was thrilled. He gave all the rest of his frosty mossy bait to Seymour. And as Pingu, with his huge fish slung across his back, staggered home up the high cliff, he and Seymour called to each other across the ice. They both knew they'd be friends forever. Barrel of Fun. Sometimes Seymour the baby seal gets bored with swimming about in icy water, catching a fish and then swimming about again. Sometimes he likes to flap about on the frozen wastes of Antarctica and look for fun. One day he was flapping about on the ice when he came across an old wooden barrel. This looks fun, he thought. Lots of the barrel's curved wooden panels were missing, and Seymour tugged out a couple more panels. The half a barrel that was left tipped onto its side. Now this really did look fun. But exactly what fun it looked, Seymour wasn't sure. Just then, he heard the unmistakable sound of a whistling penguin. It was Pingu. Seymour was delighted to see him. And the two friends greeted each other joyfully. Seymour wondered if Pingu knew what fun they could have with half a barrel. Of course, Pingu knew right away. Half a barrel could be a sledge. Pingu jumped into the brand new barrel sledge and Seymour pushed him across the ice. Pingu enjoyed it much more than Seymour did, so after a bit they swapped round. If only they could find a place where they could slide down on their half-a-barrel sledge. No one would have to do any pushing. And then they came to the top of a long and winding hill. Pingu jumped onto the front of the half-a-barrel sledge and Seymour started it sliding down the hill and then jumped onto the back as the sledge slithered helter-skelter down the long and winding hill, over bumps, past lumps, and round bends until they reached the bottom. They slithered past a mighty tower of snow, just avoiding some huge chunks of falling ice. Soon the sledge came to a halt. Seymour was ready for another trip. So was Pingu. So, back up the long and winding hill they pushed their half-a-barrel sledge, until they reached the top. Once again they slithered helter-skelter down the hill. It was even more fun this time. As Pingu and Seymour slithered past the mighty tower of snow, even more huge chunks fell from the top. But Pingu and Seymour hugged each other with joy at the fun of it all. Seymour thought they could have an even more exciting ride. This time, he flapped his way alone to the top of the long and winding hill. There, he found a long and winding rope. He tied one end round his middle and rolled the other end down to Pingu, who tied it to the half-a-barrel sledge. When all was ready, Pingu jumped aboard the sledge and signalled to Seymour. Seymour ran the rope round an icy rock and then began to slide down the long and winding hill as Pingu and the sledge were pulled up the hill. Soon Pingu sliding up, past Seymour sliding down. When he reached the bottom, Seymour couldn't wait to start all over again. So, while Pingu untied the rope from the sledge, he flapped all the way back up that long and winding hill. Pingu was already sitting at the front of the half-a-barrel sledge. Seymour jumped onto the back, and off they went again, faster and faster. But now the half-a-barrel bumped over a lumpy hump of snow, and Seymour was thrown off. Pingu sped alone down the long and winding hill, until the sledge crashed slap into the mighty tower of snow. The mighty tower collapsed in huge chunks all over Pingu in the half-a-barrel sledge. He disappeared in a mass of white. When Seymour came to the bottom of the hill and Pingu was gone, he was terrified. He must try to help Pingu. He pulled aside a bit of barrel sticking from the snow, making a hole just big enough for Pingu to poke his tiny wing through. Seymour knew what he must do. He flapped his lonely way far across the icy wastes. Exhausted, he came upon the house of Mr. Pinga Bird, the famous Antarctic rescuer. He knocked on the door and gasped out the tale of Pingu's accident. Mr. Pinga Bird placed Seymour onto his emergency ambulance sledge and sped across the ice to the mighty tower of snow. Now Mr. Pinga Bird knew just what to do. With a mighty heave, he raised a huge slab of snow and held it steady while Seymour crawled beneath and hauled Pingu to safety. Mr. Penguin put the two shivering friends onto his ambulance sledge, and Seymour wrapped his flippers around Pingu. Then Mr. Penguin wrapped a blanket around them both. Pingu and Seymour had forgotten all about their ruined half-a-barrel sledge. Thanks to brave Mr. Penguin, they would soon be home. Warm and safe. Jealousy. One of the good things about being an only penguin is that your parents give you all their attention. And one of the worst things about having a baby sister is that quite often your parents take no notice of you at all. Anyway, that's what Pingu thinks when his mama is fussing about over his little sister and he just has to play on his own. One particular fussy morning, Mama insisted that Pingu should play very quietly with his wooden bricks. He built a castle. It was coming along very well, but when Pingu tried to add a high turret to the castle, the whole thing collapsed. That really upset Pingu. Quickly, he built another castle. Down came all the bricks again. This time, he was furious. Mama took no notice at all. Oh no, she was too busy settling little Pinga down for her afternoon nap. Soon her chick was asleep, and Mama settled down to her knitting. Pingu had now built an even grander castle than ever before. Just one last brick for the topmost turret. The castle rocked and tumbled to the ground. At first, Pingu sat down and wept. Then he began building again. This time he would make the highest tower the world had ever seen. It all went perfectly. Once again, the topmost brick was put in place, and the whole lot came tumbling down. Pingu sat down and wept even louder. He'd had quite enough of building. He hated building. He strolled to the cradle for a look at his sister. But she wasn't much use. She was just lying there fast asleep. So Pingu tried his mama. But she was too busy with her knitting. However much Pingu pleaded, it was no good. Pingu would simply have to go and play on his own. He had another look at Pinga, and this time she woke up. But not to play, just to cry. Mama dashed straight past Pingu and picked up the weeping chick. That Pinga, she was getting a cuddle when it was Pingu's turn. He threw himself into the cradle and tried kicking and crying, just like Pinga. But Mama went on cuddling Pinga. It seemed Pingu could burst his lungs, but Mama would rather play with his sister. Right, time for tougher tactics, thought Pingu, and he bounced furiously up and down on Pinga's cradle. But what was this? Mama was still ignoring him. She was busy giving Pinga some crawling practice. And then it was time for Mama to help Pinga do a little bouncing. Bouncing? Pingu could show her bouncing. Still, nobody took any notice. Pingu jumped off the cradle and wandered miserably about. Until he came across Pinga's pink potty. He kicked that about for a bit. But all Mama did was dangle Pinga in the air. There was only one thing for it. Pingu put the potty on his head, picked up a wooden spoon, and became a mighty army. But however mightily the army marched, Mama went on fiddling about with Pinga. Now Pinga was having her bottle of warm milk. When Pingu challenged Mama to a battle, she turned away and went on feeding her baby. Pingu hurled away the potty. But still, Pinga went on drinking milk. Back at the cradle, Pingu had an idea. He put Pinga's warm green blanket over his head and became a great green monster. The monster raced round and round Mama and Pinga. But they ignored him. They just carried on, cooing and cuddling as again Pingu trudged to the cradle. He flopped across it and pretended to be ill. Mama hurried across with Pinga in her arms and told Pingu to get out of the way while she lay the baby down again. Pingu trudged to the toy box, jumped in, and felt miserable. Then the telephone rang. At last, Mama looked up from the cradle and she took no notice of the telephone. Instead, she noticed Pingu. She came and stroked his head. And he leapt into Mama's outstretched wings. She carried him to the cradle and rocked both her happy little penguins to sleep. Lost Baby. Having a baby sister is hard work for a young penguin. Ever since little Pinga arrived, Pingu's mama and papa keep telling him to be grown up and sensible, which he doesn't much like. One particular afternoon, it was time for Pinga to get some fresh air. Mama had settled her down on Pingu's sledge and tied a bright orange woolly scarf around her fluffy neck. Pingu was sitting impatiently on the roof of their ice and snow house, as yet again Mama told him he'd got to be terribly sensible and look after his sister. At last, Pinga waved goodbye to Mama. Now Pingu could slide off the roof and set off across the ice with his sledge. Pinga really enjoyed being tugged along by her big brother. But Pingu was soon fed up with tugging the little chick across the icy wastes. So he cheered up the moment he saw his penguin pal, Pengru. Pengru had planned a game of leapfrog. Pinga wanted to join in, of course. But the other two penguins took no notice and got on with their game. First, Pengru bent forward and Pingu ran up and leapt over his back. Then they swapped round. Pingu bent forward and Pengru leapt over his back. Pinga hated being left out. She jumped off the sledge and asked if she could play. What a pest! Pingu sent her straight back, but Pinga wouldn't go. So Pingu did what any grown-up and sensible elder brother would do. He gave in and bent forward so that Pinga could leap over him. Pinga, of course, was much too small to leap over Pingu, and she landed smack on his back. She was ruining the game. Pingu wanted Pinga to go back and sit on the sledge. When she still wouldn't go, Pingu put on his sternest voice, just like Papa, and chased her back to the sledge. She must not move a feather. All this time, poor old Pengru had been waiting to get on with the game. But at last, he and Pingu could get down to some serious leapfrog. Back at the sledge, Pinga was miserable. tears tumbled through her fluffy chick feathers and splashed over her tiny feet. Pingu and his pal were having such a great time, leaping over each other and sliding about on the ice, that they'd forgotten all about her. Pingu was showing off his latest skating tricks when suddenly he noticed something. Or rather, he noticed nothing. Pingu's sledge was empty. The two young penguins stared in horror. Where was Pinga? They must find her. Pingu dashed off to look for her one way, while Pingu dashed off another way. Pingu searched high and low, through hillocks of snow and valleys of ice. Pingu searched low and high, amongst caves of ice and pillars of snow. Pingu's frightened voice echoed across the frozen landscape. But there was no reply. Pingu was scared. Then Pingu called him. He discovered tiny penguin footprints in the snow. Pinga must have been this way. The two worried young penguins followed the trail of footprints. But now they saw something orange lying in the ground up ahead. They hurried across the snow. The something was Pinga's woolly scarf. And just beyond, Pingu saw a cavernous hole in the snow. Was Pinga down there? Pingu and Pingu peered into the hole. They could see nothing but dark, distant depths. Had Pinga tumbled down into those dark, distant depths? Pingu called into the hole. All he heard was the echo of his own voice. He was so frightened, not even Pingu could comfort him. Mournfully, the two penguins set off home through the frosty gloom. By the time they reached Pingu's ice and snow house, the day was gone and the sky was black. Pingu hardly dared open the door and tell Mama what had happened, although Pingu told him he must. But the door opened anyway, and there was Mama. As Pingu tried to tell her how he'd lost his baby sister, great tears rolled along his beak and splashed into the frozen snow. And yet Mama didn't seem at all upset. Pingu peered past her into the house, and there, in her high chair, was his baby sister Pinga. The clever little chick had made her own way home. Pingu was overjoyed, and after all that worry and fear, did what any grown-up and sensible elder brother would do. He bashed his little sister with the orange woolly scarf. But Mama knew he'd had a terrible fright, and soon she calmed him down. She hung up the scarf, and Pingu and Pinga looked at each other. Pingu flung his tiny penguin wings around his tiny penguin sister and gave the baby penguin, who wasn't lost after all, a bottle of delicious warm milk. Building igloos. Far south in the frozen Antarctic, you don't get long, hot summer holidays. So whenever there's a pleasant sunny day, a young penguin like Pingu makes the best of it. One particular pleasant sunny day, Pingu was busy packing a basket, which he'd fixed onto his best sledge. He put in a book, a toy aeroplane, and a whale oil lamp. Mama and Papa looked on as they sunned themselves outside their ice and snow house. Mama reminded Pingu that he might well need his bucket, and he nipped indoors to fetch it. Papa was pleased to see how hard Pingu could work when he really wanted. Pingu returned with his bucket and put it into the basket, covered everything up with a good warm blanket and shut the lid. Now it was nearly time to say goodbye to Mama. And Papa, who gave Pingu some good advice about keeping warm and safe. Papa also gave him the red woolly hat he'd been knitting for weeks and weeks. Pingu wasn't keen on red woolly hats. They're so itchy. But Papa insisted he must wear it, as even pleasant sunny days are cold in the frozen Antarctic. Pingu pleased Papa by obediently pulling on the red woolly hat. By now, he'd smelled an interesting smell.
Fish.
And Papa pointed out a row of tasty fish, hake, haddock and halibut, drying in the sunshine. Pingu sledged over to the fish and popped a pair of them into his basket. At last it was time to wave goodbye, and Pingu set off to make the best of the day. He felt really pleased with himself as he arrived at the house of his great penguin pal, Penguin, who was ready and waiting beside his own best sledge. They had a great plan for the day, and together they sledged off in the bright sunshine, through the sparkling white countryside, until they reached a huge pile of snow blocks. These blocks of snow were of many different shapes and sizes, just right for the great plan. Today, they were going to build their very own ice and snow house, their very own igloo. The only trouble was, Pingu wanted to build the igloo over here, but Penguin wanted to build it over there, and they just couldn't agree. So, Penguin took a block of snow and moved it over there, while Pingu took a block of snow and moved it over here. Pingu fetched another block, and then more and more blocks. Already he was building up the wall of his igloo, and he was pleased with himself again. Over there, Penguin was working just as hard. He'd collected lots of snow blocks, and already he'd built quite a big wall. So Pingu busily built an igloo over here, and Penguin busily built an igloo over there. Pingu would take a block of snow to his igloo, and Penguin would take a block of snow to his igloo, until finally there was only one block of snow left. Both Pingu and Penguin wanted that last block. They tugged it this way and that until they got so cross they forgot all about the block, leapt on each other and rolled about struggling in the snow. They created such a disturbance that Pingu's igloo collapsed. Penguin thought that was hilarious, but Pingu was furious. Then all the din and disturbance made Penguin's igloo collapse. Penguin was furious, but Pingu thought it was hilarious. Then they both looked at the two heaps of collapsed snow blocks and both felt really sad. So they forgot their arguments and shook wings. Together they set to work carrying blocks of snow from over there and from over here to what they agreed was, after all, the very best place to build their igloo. In no time, they'd built half their igloo. They stopped for a moment and talked about what fun it was to work together. Then they carried on building. And in only a bit longer than no time, they were building the very top of the sloping igloo walls. Pingu called out for the last blocks and fitted them into place. Soon he was placing the very last block of snow onto the roof of the igloo. The two penguins were full of their triumph. They crawled into the igloo, tugging Pingu's basket with them. Pingu unpacked his warm blanket and his whale oil lamp, and soon the brand new igloo became the cosiest ice and snow house in the whole of Antarctica. To Penguin's delight, Pingu produced the two tasty fish from his basket, and the two penguins settled happily to the most delicious supper they'd ever eaten. So, as the pleasant sun of the day gave way to the twinkling stars of the night, a brand new igloo glowed warm and safe amongst the icy wastes. Music lessons. Far, far away on the Antarctic ice cap, baby penguins grow up quite quickly and soon want to join in older brothers' games. Pingu's little sister Pinga certainly did. She always wanted to do whatever he was doing. One afternoon, Pingu was building a castle with his wooden bricks, and Pinga was crawling round and round trying to help. But Pingu would only let her watch. At the kitchen table, Mama was helping Papa make a cake. She watched as Papa stirred the mixture. She wondered if he'd put in all the ingredients. But Papa prided himself that he never forgot anything. On the floor, Pingu was proud of his castle. And Pinga was proud of her brother. Except that he'd never let her help. She pattered about the icy floor until she discovered Pingu's trumpet. Pingu forgot all about his castle. Music was the thing now. He opened up the toy box and looked for more instruments, as Papa proudly gave Mama a lick of his cake mixing spoon. When... yes, Pingu had found his accordion. It was too much for Mama. She needed a bit of peace and quiet. But Pingu didn't. Now it was Papa who needed a bit of peace and quiet, and he gave the young penguins a telling off. Then he returned to his cake making. But you can't stifle a young penguin's musical instinct, and Pingu wanted to see what would happen when he held his accordion upside down. Yes, it would make a horrible din. Mama couldn't stand this. If Pingu wanted to play the accordion, he'd have to go somewhere else. So off he went to find penguins who'd appreciate him. Of course, Pinga wanted to go too, but Mama wouldn't let her. So, of course, Pinga was upset. She sat on the floor and wept great big tears. Outside, Pingu had put his accordion on his sledge and was sliding about the village looking for an audience. Near the post office, Mrs. Pengsniff was complaining to her neighbours about how modern penguin youth was nothing like it had been in her young day. They couldn't agree more. Mr. Pengrooge told them that youngsters simply didn't have any respect for their elders and betters. They couldn't agree more. When Pingu began his concert, the neighbours fled and bolted their doors and windows. Pingu was amazed. Didn't anyone in Antarctica appreciate music? He tried a slightly different tune. But nobody came to listen. He tried another. But the street remained deserted. So Pingu put his accordion back onto his sledge and went in search of someone who could help him. At the far end of the village lived the brilliant musician Professor Pengelson. As Pingu approached his house, he could see the great penguin sitting in the frosty sunshine, his accordion on his knee. And the professor greeted Pingu with his favourite tune. Pingu was spellbound. The professor asked Pingu to play something on his own accordion. But he was horrified at what he heard. He offered to teach Pingu how to play beautifully. The professor showed Pingu how the tune should begin. And Pingu tried to copy him. Pingu had got a few notes right, and next time he got a bit nearer. The professor was pleased, and so was Pingu. Then he and the professor played together. Then they played a bit faster. As the professor encouraged Pingu. When they'd finished, Pingu was thrilled. He couldn't wait to get home and play his tune. The professor wished him luck as Pingu sped back over the snow. Back home, Mama and Papa didn't want to hear another performance. The din might ruin the cake baking in the oven. But Pingu played anyway. And it seemed he really had learnt to play his accordion. When he played again, Pinga found a stick and joined in. Then Mama and Papa joined in, and all evening long the penguin family played together. Until Pingu smelled a strange smell. Yes, Papa's cake had burnt. Pingu runs away. Every evening in their ice and snow home, Pingu's Mama and Papa like to settle down with Pingu to a penguin family's favourite supper. But Pingu gets bored with his boiled fish, his boiled potatoes and his boiled green vegetables. One evening, Papa was thoroughly enjoying his boiled fish. Mama was thoroughly enjoying her favourite treat, boiled beetroot. But Pingu was thoroughly hating his boiled green vegetables. He poked those greens all round his plate. Mama and Papa were chatting about how much they loved their food. Mama tried a little of Papa's fish. Papa tried a little of Mama's beetroot. Then Mama offered Pingu a little of her beetroot. Beetroot? Yuck! Pingu pushed it away. The horrid beetroot flew from Mama's fork and landed splat, all purply red over her clean white penguin feathers. Mama was shocked. Papa was furious. But Pingu took no notice. He ignored Mama when she scolded him. While Mama tried to wipe the purply red mess from her feathers, Pingu started to rock backwards and forwards on his chair. Until he'd rocked so far, he tried to stop himself falling backwards by grabbing the tablecloth. But he fell anyway. And the cloth, the cutlery, the plates and the supper all fell down with him. Papa was more furious than ever. And even Mama was so cross, she put Pingu over her knee and smacked his feathery bottom. Pingu thought his Mama and Papa were being thoroughly unfair. While Mama and Papa cleared up the mess, Pingu trudged miserably out of his ice and snow home. Mama and Papa thought he'd soon stop being upset and cross. But they didn't know just how upset and cross Pingu really was. Still miserable, he set off beneath the night sky across the icy Antarctic snow. Back home, Papa had settled down to his knitting. He was making another red woolly hat for Pingu. Mama was reading her daily pengigraph when she noticed it was getting rather late. But Papa told her not to worry. Pingu would soon be home and perhaps he'd have learnt his lesson. But out in the cold and beneath the eerie starlight, Pingu had decided he would never go back home, even though he was lost amongst great rocks of ice and huge looming boulders of snow. He had to leap for his life as a huge mound of snow tumbled from an icy cliff, and scoot away as an even huger mound of snow fell from another cliff. Scurrying about, Pingu came upon a vast pillar of ice which towered above like a gnarled, misshapen skull. Pingu hurried past. He almost ran into another vast pillar of ice. It looked like some grotesque, monstrous hand. Pingu was lost, miserable and frightened. He scuttled through the fearsome landscape until at last he found a tiny cave of ice. There Pingu sat and waited. For he knew not what. Back home, Mama was worried. Where was Pingu? Now Papa agreed that, yes, they really should go out into the night and search for their young penguin. So out they went. Stars glistened bright upon the Antarctic snow as Mama called out, The only reply was silence. Mama told Papa to fetch his tractor sledge. Papa agreed. Mama called out again as Papa drove up in his sledge and they set off across the ice and snow. In his tiny cave, Pingu stopped shivering for a moment. He'd heard Mama's voice. He called out. Mama heard his voice. Only moments later, she was hugging Pingu to her soft, warm feathers. Mama called out to Papa, and he drove up on the tractor sledge. Mama and Papa wrapped Pingu in warm blankets, while Papa told him he must never, ever run away again. And back home they all drove on the tractor sledge. Papa opened the door of the ice and snow house, which glowed a deep, warm orange against the white snow all round. Mama sat Pingu on her knee and spooned warm, nourishing soup into his grateful little beak, while Papa piled extra logs onto the stove. Then Mama and Papa lay Pingu between them as they all snuggled down in their big, cosy bed. And soon the penguin family were all fast asleep. Pingu and Pinga stay up. With two lively young penguins about the ice and snow house, Pingu's mama finds life very tiring. One evening, Papa was out with his pals at the Ice Cap Working Penguins Club, and Mama was worn out. It was time for Pingu and his baby sister Pinga to go to bed. But they were playing so happily together, building towers and bridges out of wooden building bricks, that Mama was only too pleased to let them carry on, while she put her feet up with a glass of walrus juice and her daily pengygraph. Once they'd used up all their wooden bricks, Pingu decided it was time to chase Pinga round the toy box. And just as baby sisters so often do, Pinga decided it was time to knock the towers and bridges to pieces. She'd ruined their game. Pingu was furious. Just as baby sisters so often do, Pinga blamed Pingu. So Pingu, of course, had to push Pinga onto the floor. Mama's rest was over. Now it really was time for bed. But first Mama took Pinga for her last bottle of warm milk. Pingu pulled silly faces and told everybody his opinion of young penguin sisters. Before bed, he had to clear up all the wooden bricks and tip them into the toy box. All he had left to play with were 2 cardboard boxes he'd found on the floor. Naturally, he put one on each foot, and now he'd made a pair of skates. As Pinga sucked on her bottle, she noticed her elder brother skating up and down the icy floor of the living room. So did Mama. This was no time for skating, she said. It was time for Pingu to wash his wings and brush his beak. Pingu skated to the bathroom. But Mama made him take off his skates. Bathrooms are not for playing in. As Pinga happily sucked her milk, Mama was pleased to hear the sounds of beak brushing from the bathroom. Inside the bathroom, Pingu was sitting on the toilet seat reading a comic and rubbing his beak brush up and down on the side of the bath. Pinga soon finished her milk, and Mama had settled her down on her little pink penguin potty. When Pingu came from the bathroom and showed Mama his clean wings and the beak paste he'd just squirted all round his mouth, Mama was pleased with him and went to tidy up the bedroom. This was the perfect moment for Pingu to give his baby sister a bit of a surprise. He gave her pink penguin potty a hefty kick and sent it slithering across the floor. Mama stormed from the bedroom and sent Pingu to tidy up the beds himself. This was a job he always hated. But it could be made fun. Pingu pulled the cover off his bed, leapt onto it and bounced up and down on the mattress. As soon as Mama cleaned up Pinga with a chick wipe, she stormed into the bedroom. Pinga followed her as Pingu tried to go off in a sulk. No sooner had Mama called him back than Pinga tried to wander off. What a pair! Eventually, the 2 young penguins were safely tucked up in bed. But as Mama said goodnight to Pingu, Pinga was up again and asking for more milk. Mama trudged off to the kitchen and brought back Pinga's milk. But now Pingu was up asking for something to eat. Mama trudged off to the kitchen and brought him back a nice juicy pilchard, just what he fancied. Now, a pilchard is a very oily fish, and by the time Pingu had chomped his way through it, Mama had to wipe great big greasy patches off his clean white feathers. Next, Pinga wanted her teddy, and Pingu wanted the rest of Pinga's milk, and Pinga had dropped her teddy. But Mama didn't come to pick it up. Where was she? Pingu and Pinga went in search. When they reached the living room, they had a terrible shock. There on the sofa was Mama, fast asleep. Mama must be tired, thought Pingu and Pinga. Pingu hurried to the bedroom and pushed his bed next to Pinga's. And still Mama slept. This was no good. Mamas can't lie about snoozing when their young penguins are still wide awake. Pingu decided to put a stop to it. Mama soon woke up, but the moment she stood up, she was yawning again. Her eyelids drooped, and she fell asleep. Pingu tried sliding Mama to the bedroom, but being pushed about on the ice woke her up again. It was about time they all went to bed. Soon, Mama was tucked up cosily in the middle of the beds Pingu had pushed together, with her 2 young penguins beside her. Noise. It was one of those long, dull days when a young penguin like Pingu just can't think how to enjoy himself. For ages, he'd been sitting around outside his ice and snow house, wondering what to do next. So he was thrilled when his penguin pal Pingu came round. At last, someone to play with. In moments, Pingu was drawing squares in the snow for a game of hopscotch, as he and Pingu worked out who should have first go. They agreed it should be Pingu, and he threw a stone onto one of the squares. Then he hopped nimbly back and forth across the snow. Pingu thought he could do even better. He threw his stone and was just hopping after it when his papa's tractor sledge appeared round the side of the house. Papa didn't want noisy young penguins hopping about outside his house and told Pingu and Pingu to clear off as he parked his tractor sledge right across their hopscotch squares. Pingu was furious. So was Pingu. But Papa took no notice. He rubbed out the squares Pingu had drawn so carefully, and when Pingu complained, Papa simply told him to watch his beak and not be so rude. He rubbed out the rest of the hopscotch squares and started to paint his own square all around his tractor sledge. Pingu and Pingu thought this was rotten, but Papa just went on painting. And when he caught Pingu trying to scrub out his square, Papa really told him off. He stuck 2 signs into the snow. One had the letter P on it, which meant this new square was now the official parking space for Papa's tractor sledge. The other sign had a big cross over a picture of a young penguin playing in the snow, which meant that young penguins were no longer allowed to play there. Papa explained all this to them. Pingu was not pleased. Pingu quickly suggested they should look for fun somewhere else. So, off they went. Pingu showed Pingu a new dance he'd invented. Pingu thought this was the funniest thing he'd seen all day. It was just bad luck that he should be roaring with laughter right under the window of that nosiest and grumpiest of neighbours, Mrs. Pengsniff. If there was one thing Mrs. Pengsniff hated more than the 1,000 other things she hated, it was noise. She flung open her window and told Pingu and Pingu just what she thought of their noise. Very noisily. Just then, Pingu and Pingu's great friend Pengwood arrived, and all 3 told Mrs. Pengsniff exactly what they thought of her noise. Mrs. Pengsniff threatened to tell their parents about their terrible rudeness. So, when Mrs. Pengsniff accidentally shut her window on her own wing, Pingu, Pingu and Pengwood thought it was the funniest thing they'd seen all day. Penguin was carrying a bouncy rubber ball. And of course, penguins absolutely love bouncing bouncy rubber balls. Soon the 3 young penguins were bouncing the ball from head to head. Until Pingu headed it a bit too hard. The ball flew from the top of his head to the top of Mrs. Pengsniff's ice and snow house, and there it bounced up and down, until Mrs. Pengsniff couldn't stand the noise any more. She rushed from her front door, caught the rubber ball as it bounced from the roof into her arms, and took it inside. As soon as she'd gone, Pingu and Penguin discussed what to do next. They decided that as Pingu was so good at seeming really polite, he would have to very politely ask Mrs. Pengsniff for their ball back. Up to her front door he went, and when Mrs. Pengsniff opened the door, he asked very politely if they might just possibly, if you please, have their ball back. But Mrs. Pengsniff simply refused and slammed the door. Pingu rang the bell again. But now Mrs. Pengsniff wouldn't even listen and slammed the door again. This was too much for Pingu. He rammed a hard lump of snow onto Mrs. Pengsniff's doorbell. So now the bell wouldn't stop ringing. Mrs. Pengsniff stormed from her front door, which immediately slammed behind her. Mrs. Pengsniff wrenched the snow from her doorbell and tried to open her door. But it had locked. And she was locked outside. This was the funniest thing Pingu, Pengu and Penguin had seen all day. But then Pingu had an idea. He suggested to Mrs. Pengsniff that he could climb in through her window and open her door. And when he did climb in and did open her door, Mrs. Pengsniff decided that he really was a polite little penguin after all. So she gave him back the bouncy rubber ball. His friends were delighted. Once again, they headed the bouncy ball from one to another. Until, once again, Pingu headed it a bit too hard. Pingu's papa happened to be taking a stroll past Mrs. Pengsniff's house just then, and the ball flew straight onto his head, and then it flew from Papa's head straight through Mrs. Pengsniff's window. And yes, that was the funniest thing Pingu, Pengu and Penguin had seen all day. Grandpa is ill. When Pingu's at home for the day, he loves to get out his paints and paint a picture of the frozen Antarctic landscape. One particular day at home, he'd covered the top bit of his paper in bright blue for the sky, and now he was painting the bottom bit of the paper white for the snow. He'd finished the picture off with a splash of yellow for the sun. He showed Mama the picture, and she liked it. Pingu's baby sister, Pinga, was crawling across the floor to look at his picture when the telephone rang, and Mama went to answer it. On the other end of the line was her papa, Pingu's grandpa. He was not feeling at all well. So Mama said she'd go and see him right away. By now, Pinga had found Pingu's red paint, and she put a great splash of red all over the beautiful white snow he'd painted. She'd ruined his picture. But Pingu had no chance to chase his irritating little sister round the room before Mama told him to stop messing about and come to Grandpa's. Pinga followed Mama and Pingu followed Pinga. But when he got to the front door, Pinga had slammed it in his face. She was leaning against it so he couldn't get out of the house. Right, he'd soon sort out that cheeky penguin chick. Pingu ran up and hurled himself at the door. But Pinga had moved away, and Pingu tumbled straight through the doorway, splat into the snow outside. Mama, of course, thought he was messing about. She was driving the tractor sledge, and Pinga was riding on the back. So Pingu fetched his own sledge and tied it to the tractor sledge. Then off they set for Grandpa's house. By now, Pingu was standing on his head, showing off to his sister. Mama told him to stop messing about and take Pinga in to see Grandpa. In they all went. Before they could ask Grandpa how he was feeling, he told them. Terrible was how he was feeling. He was wrapped in a blanket, and his poor old head was covered in big brown spots. Mama told the children they must be very quiet and not get too close to Grandpa. So they just waved at him. And he waved back. Mama put more wood on the fire, and the two young penguins tried to cheer up Grandpa by dancing round and round his armchair. This only made his poor old head hurt even more. So Mama sent them off to be quiet somewhere else. But soon Pingu found a pan of nourishing broth warming on the stove and couldn't resist sniffing and fiddling with it until the lid fell off. Mama was fed up with Pingu messing about. But while she was testing the broth, Pingu showed his little sister one of his favourite treasures, Grandpa's wardrobe. They tried on all his old-fashioned hats and slid about the icy floor in them until they both skated into his wardrobe. All Grandpa's prized possessions tumbled out. His poor old head was throbbing. Mama sent the two naughty penguins to play outside. Peace at last, and Mama could feed Grandpa some nourishing broth. But now someone seemed to be knocking at the front door. Outside, Pingu was playing foot snowball. The door was the goal. Pinga was the very small goalkeeper, and all Pingu's shots were whizzing past her into the door. Mama rushed out to see what was going on. And suddenly, one of Pingu's foot snowballs landed splat in her face. The two young penguins thought this was hilarious. Mama had had quite enough messing about for one day. She packed them straight off home on Pingu's sledge, which cheered them both up no end. While Mama fed Grandpa some more nourishing broth, at home Pingu had a new plan. He found his brown paint and covered his head in great big brown spots. Pingu wanted some spots too, and soon her head was covered in big brown spots. Now for the next part of the plan. Pingu telephoned Grandpa's house, where Mama was putting soothing ointment on Grandpa's head. When the telephone rang, Mama answered it. It was, of course, Pingu calling her to say he and his sister had been taken ill. Poor Mama. She sped straight home on the tractor sledge. And hurried into the bedroom to find Pingu and Pinga covered in big brown spots. She soothed poor Pingu's brow and was surprised to find her wings smeared with brown paint. Pingu giggled as Mama tested Pinga's brow. Now both wings were smeared with brown paint. And Mama realised what her two young penguins had been up to. But she was so thrilled they weren't really ill, she let Pingu paint her own face with great big brown spots. Pinga was bouncing up and down on one of the beds, and Mama even tried bouncing on the other bed, but she was a bit too heavy. Well, that's Mama Penguins for you. Pingu and Pinga at home. It's not very often that Pingu's mama and papa go out for the evening. But when they do, Papa always puts Pingu in charge of the ice and snow house and his baby sister Pinga. And Pingu always promises to be grown up and sensible. One evening, Mama and Papa were looking forward to a grand symphony concert at the Penguin Hall. In the bathroom, Mama, who loves music, was putting on her makeup, powder and beak stick. Then she put on her best hat and came out to make sure her two little ones were snugly tucked up in their beds. Then it was off to the concert. Pingu and Pinga sadly waved goodbye as Papa opened the front door for Mama. Pingu and Pinga were crying, and Mama was sad to leave them. Papa was sure they'd soon be asleep. But as they set off into the night, Mama's thoughts kept returning to her young penguins in their little beds. On those little beds, though Mama wasn't to know it, Pingu and Pinga were bouncing up and down like a pair of black and white yo-yos. Then, once they'd had enough of that, Pingu told his sister to turn on the radio, while he put more logs on the wood stove. At the Penguin Hall, Mama and Papa arrived as the orchestra were tuning their instruments, and they hurried to their seats. By now, Pingu had heated up the stove and was showing his little sister how brilliant he was at making pancakes, and especially at tossing them. He could even toss a pancake up high, spin round and round, and catch it again on the way down. Pinga was amazed. She was even more amazed next time Pingu tossed the pancake. It flew straight up to the roof and stuck there. Pinga shouted at the pancake to come down again. Soon it did. It flopped splat over Pingu's head and hung off the end of his beak, making it look like the trunk of an elephant. In their seats at the concert, Mama and Papa were enjoying their music, happy that Pingu and Pinga would by now be fast asleep. In fact, Pingu was by now showing Pinga how to bounce bouncy rubber balls. Pinga wanted to see what would happen if she bounced the ball at the bookshelf. And of course, the bookshelf fell down. At the concert, Papa had closed his eyes to concentrate on the beautiful music. But Mama soon woke him up before anyone noticed. At home, Pingu and Pinga were enjoying their beautiful music too, as Pingu hauled their parents' clothes from the wardrobe. Now they could dress up as Mama and Papa. Pinga felt gorgeous in Mama's best flowery hat. And Pingu felt handsome in Papa's finest top hat. At the concert, Mama and Papa gazed lovingly at the photo she always carried of Pingu and Pinga. Soon they would be going home, where Pinga was having a great time in the bathroom. She'd set the taps running and was wallowing up to her neck in Mama's birthday bubble bath. Pingu leapt in to join her. Together they rocked the bath from side to side until it toppled over. At the Penguin Hall, the concert had finished. Mama and Papa joined in the enormous applause, and at that very moment, Pingu noticed the living room clock. He realised that his parents were due home at any minute. Hurriedly, Pinga mopped up the bathroom while Pingu rushed about straightening the furniture and mending the bookshelf. As Pingu tried to stuff all the clothes back into the wardrobe, just in time, Pinga remembered to turn off the radio. In the crisp, clear moonlight, Mama and Papa were approaching the ice and snow house, where Pingu had just turned their wardrobe onto its back and was jumping up and down trying to squash the clothes back inside. Mama and Papa were at the front door. They opened it just in time to see two innocent little penguins tucked up in their beds. Mama thought her wardrobe looked a little odd. She didn't remember leaving it with trousers bulging from doors and jumpers spilling from shelves. As soon as she touched them, all the clothes tumbled out. Which, of course, woke Pingu and Pinga up. Mama wanted to know if they'd gone to sleep quickly, while Papa wanted to know if they could explain why the wardrobe doors were bulging. But of course they couldn't. Once Mama had packed the clothes neatly away, she hugged Pingu and Papa hugged Pinga, and the penguin family settled down to sleep, all of them with happy thoughts of a thoroughly enjoyable evening. Hide and seek. The days Pingu hates most are the days when every young penguin in Antarctica seems to be busy, except Pingu. One such day, Pingu had played with every single one of his toys for at least a few seconds, and now it was time to explore the wide, white world outside. There was his sledge. That should be fun for a lot of seconds, perhaps even a minute. Pingu pushed himself across the snow until he came to his favourite place of icy rocks and pillars of snow. There was usually fun to be had round here, so Pingu and his sledge went exploring. But amongst all those rocks and pillars, they found nothing. Then, from behind a snowy rock, Pingu heard a sound. He knew that laugh. It was Seymour, the baby seal. Seymour flapped round the rock to Pingu, and they hugged each other. Now there'd be fun. Seymour sat at the front of the sledge, and Pingu pushed them along with his feet. Until Pingu spotted a group of ruined ice and snow igloos, and amongst them, piles of old abandoned wooden barrels. Now, Pingu and Seymour had had fun with barrels before, so they hurried over. Together, they raced round and round the first ruined igloo. But soon, Pingu was racing on his own. Where was Seymour? Well, the baby seal had cunningly hidden himself inside the ruined igloo, and when Pingu raced past a window, Seymour leapt out. Seymour thought it was brilliant. Pingu didn't. Until, of course, he thought of hiding himself and leaping out when Seymour flapped past. Pingu thought it was brilliant and celebrated by dancing his famous penguin frightening dance. Then he rushed off among the other igloos while Seymour tried to keep up with him. After a few moments of rushing, Pingu realised that Seymour had vanished again. Where was he now? Pingu was giving his head a good scratch when Seymour splatted Pingu with a snowball. Already, Pingu was making his own snowball. He hurled it at Seymour. Too late. Seymour had ducked out of sight, but Pingu was after him. He chased the baby seal all around the ruined igloos until Seymour vanished yet again. Pingu feared the worst. Yes, Seymour was ready with another snowball. Ha! Missed, he thought, and Pingu quickly made a snowball himself. He hurled it over his wall towards Seymour, who was hiding behind another wall, ready to fire his own snowball. Missed again. But this was now a battle. After some time, Pingu still hadn't managed to hit Seymour, and Seymour teased Pingu. Pingu wasn't having that, but what he did have was a plan. Behind his wall, he'd spotted some black, squashy, rubbery blubber. He rolled it, bashed it, and squeezed it, until it was round, like a head. With some ice and a pair of pebbles, Pingu made eyes for the head, and with a handy lump of orange stone, he made a beak. Yes, Pingu had made a clever model of his own head. He stuck the model penguin head on a long stick and pushed it above the top of his wall. And Seymour was fooled. When Pingu had carefully made the biggest snowball of the day, he crept from behind his wall, leaving the model head poking above it. Seymour hurled his giant snowball, and it splattered into the model head, which collapsed in a small heap onto the snow. Seymour hurried across to the collapsed head as Pingu hurried towards the pile of barrels. When Seymour saw his snowball had just hit some squashy old blubber, he was fed up. But now Pingu was on the march, with a barrel right over his head and just his feet sticking out. Seymour called to Pingu, who marched nearer, still hidden in the barrel. As Seymour peered all round, Pingu launched the mightiest snowball yet. It landed right beside Seymour's head. Wherever Seymour looked, he just couldn't see Pingu, who was, of course, still hidden inside his barrel. At last, Seymour spotted the penguin in the barrel. He chased him in and out of the ruined igloos, until Pingu tripped and tumbled out of his barrel. Then Seymour toppled head over heels over another barrel. This time he really had hurt himself. Pingu hurried to the baby seal and tried to cheer him up. By standing on his head, sticking his head between his legs, and turning head over heels backwards. That almost worked. Seymour almost smiled. So Pingu leapt inside a barrel and lifted off the metal hoop that held it together. He put the hoop round his middle and began to dance his famous penguin hula hoop dance. At last Seymour laughed again. And so finally, Pingu was even busier than any other young penguin in Antarctica. School time. The life of a young penguin in the cold climes of Antarctica isn't all fun and games and getting into trouble. Sometimes even Pingu has to go to school. One morning, after eating up all his fish crispies, Pingu set out with his satchel on his back. He hadn't gone far when he heard a familiar sound. It was Seymour, the baby seal. He came rushing up to Pingu and flapped along with him until they came to the top of Slithering Slope. Seymour wanted to have the first slither, and down he went. Pingu took the satchel off his back, dropped it on the hard-packed snow, and lay down on top. He'd made himself a satchel sledge. And he too had a great slide down Slithering Slope. Pingu and Seymour soon arrived at Mr. Penchip's school for infant penguins. A row of snow desks and snow stools stood side by side on the ice in front of an enormous blackboard. Suddenly, the door of Mr. Penchip's study opened and out came the teacher himself. It was time for Seymour to leave, and he dived neatly into the icy water of the school fishing hole. Mr. Penchips rang the school bell, and Pingu's two friends, Pengu and Penguid, hurried across the ice to their snow desks. Mr. Penchips greeted his class. Who would be star pupil today? The first lesson was to be things to eat that you find in a fishing hole. Mr. Penchips picked Pengu from the class and sent him to the school fishing hole. Pengu took a deep breath and dived into the icy water. Moments later, Pengu leapt from the fishing hole and told Mr. Penchips what he'd seen down there. He was asked to draw on the blackboard a picture of what he'd seen. It was a haddock. Penguid volunteered to go next, and he too dived into the fishing hole. Moments later, Penguid leapt out again and described what he'd seen down there. And Mr. Penchips asked Penguid to draw on the blackboard a picture of what he'd seen. It was the skeleton of a haddock, announced Penguid. Mr. Penchips wasn't too pleased. Not even penguins can eat fish bones, he explained. So it's a waste of time even looking for them. Now Pingu had an idea. He said he could draw what was in the fishing hole without even going to look. But the others didn't believe him. Pingu then barked like a baby seal and flapped about on the ice just like Seymour. Mr. Penchips and his pupils wanted to know what on ice Pingu was meant to be. So Pingu went up to the blackboard and drew a picture of a baby seal. But nobody believed he'd see a baby seal in a school fishing hole. Pingu took a fish he'd been saving, a mullet actually, from under his snow desk and held it over the fishing hole. Up leapt Seymour. And with one bite, reduced Pingu's mullet to a skeleton. Then Seymour slipped back into the icy water. Mr. Penchips and his pupils were impressed. They wanted to meet Seymour. Pingu called his friend, and the baby seal leapt from the fishing hole into the school. Mr. Penchips asked Seymour to help with the lesson. Seymour dived into the water and reappeared with a haddock in his mouth. Mr. Penchips displayed the haddock on his blackboard. No sooner had he hung the haddock than Seymour popped up from the hole with a long, wriggly eel. As Mr. Penchips hung up the eel, Seymour produced a flat fish that looked just like an omelette with a tail and fins. This was a plaice. Seymour disappeared again and this time returned with a lobster. Soon the lobster joined the other sea creatures hanging from Mr. Penchips' blackboard. The teacher asked his pupils to name the creatures. Penguid recognised the haddock, and then Mr. Penchips pointed to the eel. When Penguid got that right too, Mr. Penchips pointed to the next fish. Pingu knew that one, but Penguid wasn't too sure. Then he remembered. It was a plaice. Now Mr. Penchips called on Pingu to name the final creature. The others knew it was a lobster, but Pingu wasn't too sure. Seymour wasn't going to let his friend look silly, and while Mr. Penchips' back was turned, he scribbled the penguin word for lobster onto the board. As soon as Pingu said the word, Seymour rubbed it out again. But Mr. Penchips was pleased. Today, all his penguin infants really were star pupils. Pingu and the Barrel Organ. seen a barrel organ. It's a rather large, unusual sort of instrument which plays tunes when you wind rolls of music through it. Far away, among the snows of Antarctica, an elderly penguin, old Mr. Penghoven, was playing his barrel organ, hoping that a passing penguin would throw money into the hat he'd laid on the ground. Pingu heard the music and came to see what was going on. He'd never seen a barrel organ before, and he loved it. He burrowed amongst his tail feathers and pulled out a shiny coin. He dropped it into old Mr. Penghoven's hat. The old barrel organist was most grateful. Pingu wanted to help the old penguin, and when he saw another penguin strolling along, he asked him to thank Mr. Penghoven for his beautiful music by giving him some money. But, to Pingu's annoyance, the grumpy penguin just turned his back and hurried away. Pingu searched all through his own feathers, but he'd got no more money to give. Old Mr. Penghoven told him not to worry. But when Pingu has decided to help, he helps. A tall, smart penguin came along now, and Pingu tried to interest him in the barrel organ. But the smart penguin just hurried past. Pingu was cross and raced after him. He jumped in front of the smart penguin and tried to stop him. But the smart penguin just pushed him aside. Pingu fell back into the snow, and the smart penguin hopped neatly over him. Pingu said exactly what he thought of smart penguins. But next, a much kinder penguin strolled across the ice, and when Pingu asked if he would help Mr. Penghoven, the kind penguin handed him a small but tasty fish. Pingu was thrilled and hurried back to Mr. Penghoven, who was tired now and taking a rest. Pingu handed him the fish. The old greying barrel organist was grateful for the kind penguin's fish and soon gobbled it all up. He was so touched, he let Pingu have a go on his barrel organ. When a wealthy-looking penguin walked by, Pingu called out to him. But the wealthy penguin wasn't interested in barrel organs. Pingu suddenly looked up into the sky, pretending he'd seen something fascinating. As the wealthy penguin strutted off, he looked up too, and not looking where he was going, stepped straight into a fishing hole. And it served him right. Mr. Penghoven felt it was time to go home, and Pingu helped by sliding the barrel organ on its runners across the ice. Soon they arrived at an ancient tumble-down igloo which had holes all over it. This was poor old Mr. Penghoven's ice and snow shack. Inside, there were only a few tattered old boxes and Mr. Penghoven's tattered old armchair. Pingu felt sad. He offered to go shopping for Mr. Penghoven, who was far too tired to go himself. Pingu took the barrel organ and pushed it first to Mother Pengpride's bakery. He played a tune outside. Now, Mother Pengpride loved barrel organs and gave Pingu free bread and rolls. Pingu then went on to Miss Pengendecker's hardware store. Miss Pengendecker also loved barrel organs. She gave Pingu a warm rug for Mr. Penghoven and some useful cleaning materials. On Pingu went again to the shop where Mr. Penganade sold bottles and bottles of delicious drinks. He loved barrel organs too and gave Pingu a pair of his best bottled drinks. Pingu went on to Mr. Pengatel's store with its fine fresh fish. Mr. Pengatel was delighted to give Pingu some fine fresh fish free. And on Pingu went again, this time back to old Mr. Penghoven's tumble-down home. He slid the barrel organ with its food and drink into the igloo. Mr. Penghoven was thrilled with what Pingu had brought him. Pingu laid a table and set out one of Mr. Pengatel's fine fresh fish with some of Mother Pengpride's best bread rolls. While the elderly penguin tucked into his meal, Pingu set about blocking up some of the holes in the igloo with planks of wood. Then he made huge snowballs and hurled them at the holes that were too high to reach. At his table, Mr. Penghoven soon finished his fish and rolls and drained a glass of Mr. Penganade's delicious drink. Pingu was throwing logs onto the crackling fire in the stove when he heard a remarkable sound. Mr. Penghoven had taken his old mouth organ from under his armchair, and he was so grateful for Pingu's kindness, he made him a present of the mouth organ. Mr. Penghoven waved his new friend goodbye. Pingu left for his own ice and snow home. As he walked along, his heart filled with the good deeds he'd done, Pingu discovered something wonderful. He was, without a single lesson, a brilliant mouth organist. Pingu's Ice Cave. Pingu's papa is a handy penguin about the house. He can cook, he can clean, and this particular morning he was doing the family ironing. He enjoyed his ironing, but always remembered to take an interest in how well young Pingu was doing at learning to write. Pingu had just finished a page of lettering and showed it to Mama, who was sitting next to him at the table. Mama was pleased with his work until she noticed a great inky blot all over one corner of the paper. She was telling Pingu to write the page all over again when there was a knock at the door. The door opened and in came Pingu's penguin pal, Pengru. He wanted Pingu to come out and play with his brand new bouncy rubber ball. All thoughts of writing flew from Pingu's head, and he begged Mama to let him play. Mama asked Papa, who knew there was no point in arguing. Pingu leapt from his chair and dashed from the house with Pengru. Out in the ice and snow, Pengru tried out his bouncy ball on his head and then tossed it to Pingu. Of course, Pingu just had to show off. He kicked the ball backwards over his head and it bounced away across the snow, followed by Pingu and Pengru. It rolled to a halt under a shelf of ice, but when Pengru went to fetch the bouncy ball, suddenly a slab of ice shifted beneath his feet and he dashed back to safety. Pingu was a lot smaller, so now he carefully tiptoed across the ice. He'd nearly reached the ball when suddenly the slab of ice shifted beneath his feet. Pengru would have to help him. Pengru sat nervously down on the other end of the slab of ice and tried to balance it. As Pingu reached out for the bouncy ball, Pengru made his big mistake. He stood up again and moved nearer to Pingu. Now the ice gave way beneath them both, and the two young penguins were sliding at high speed down a dangerous slope of ice, until they found themselves in a cave of ice far below. Pengru looked all around, while Pingu sat down and cried. Pengru thought they should try to struggle back up the dangerous slope of ice. But from above came a crash. Tons of snow were falling, and the hole the young penguins had fallen through was blocked. They were trapped in the ice cave. Now Pengru sat down and cried. Pingu realised they'd have to explore the mysterious gleaming white cave, but first they should find out if there was anyone else down there. no reply. So on through the cave they went, with its weird columns of ice hanging from the roof, and its strange icy shapes clinging to the walls and floor.
Pingu!
Carefully they made their way along narrow ice ledges, past mighty chasms,
And now we're laughing.
and through tiny passages until Pingu came upon a pile of abandoned miners' tools. And beyond was a steep path of ice leading to light above. But Pingu had spotted that the road ahead had given way. The path seemed suddenly to end in a sheer drop to who knows what below. But Pingu wouldn't give up. There was a miner's rope hanging from a peg in the ice wall high above. He would swing across the chasm below to the path he could see on the other side. He landed safely on the far side, but his swing had been too much for the peg. The rope came away from the wall. How was Pingu to get across? But still, Pingu wouldn't give up. He made a loop in the end of the rope and flung it across the chasm towards Pingu. The loop fell neatly over a column of ice. On his side of the chasm, Pingu stretched the rope tightly around another column. Now, Pingu would be able to cross the rope wing over wing. Pingu was scared, but he took hold of the rope and launched himself into mid-air. Inch by inch, he struggled along the rope. But Pingu kept it tight. And Pingu made it across. Now they had to struggle up the steep path of ice ahead. Pingu went first, and with a mighty effort reached the top. Pingu followed on wings and knees and joined Pingu. Above was a rickety wooden trap door. With a heave, they pushed it aside and helped each other from the ice cave onto the safe, snowy ground above. That, thought Pingu, is enough adventure for one day. Pingu plays fish tennis. Whenever Seymour, the baby seal, leaves the icy waters of the Antarctic, he's out for fun and games. So, the morning he found his penguin pal Pingu snoozing outside his ice and snow house, he was pretty fed up. But at last, Pingu woke up. And Seymour thought he'd start the fun and games with a snowball. It whizzed past Pingu and squelched onto the wall beside him. Pingu jumped. He looked around, but all he could see was the snowman who often stood outside his ice and snow house. The snowman seemed to call to Pingu. But snowmen can't call, and they can't move, and they certainly can't throw snowballs. Pingu peered all about, but again the snowman seemed to call him. Then Seymour appeared from behind the snowman and hurled another snowball at Pingu. Pingu was now rather cross and marched across the snow towards the baby seal, who dashed back behind the snowman, and then popped out again, carrying a great big floppy fish, which he slid across the snow at Pingu. Pingu fell splat over the slithering floppy fish. He wobbled back and forth on his tummy like a feathery seesaw. But then Seymour helped Pingu back onto his flippers, and at last Pingu began to see the joke. Now then, thought the two friends, What games could we play with this great big floppy fish? Pingu was really impressed when Seymour balanced the fish on his nose. He was like a juggler in an ice circus. Then Seymour flipped the floppy fish to Pingu, who dropped it. When Pingu tried to pick up the slippery fish in his penguin wings, it shot away across the ice. Pingu hurried after the fish and tried to pick it up again. But again the fish shot away from him. Seymour thought this was a great laugh, but Pingu didn't. He'd had enough of these fishy antics, so he dived on the great floppy nuisance and this time scooped it up in his wings. Then he hurled it at Seymour, who caught it neatly on the end of his nose and bounced it up and down, just as though it were a rubber ball. Then he slid across the snow, still bouncing the fish on his nose. What a show-off! But now it was Pingu's turn to show off. He balanced the ball on top of his head and danced his famous penguin balancing dance. Then he flung the fish high into the air. It flew higher and higher, and then flopped head down, mouth open, splat over Pingu's head. Pingu looked like a penguin in a fish turban, so now he did his famous penguin turban dance. Now Seymour was really impressed. But Pingu had had quite enough, thank you very much, so he made Seymour pull the fish off. By the time Pingu had checked his head hadn't been pulled off as well, Seymour was playing with the fish on the far side of Pingu's mama's washing line. Pingu hurried to join him. He wanted to go with the fish. Seymour threw it to him across the washing line. Pingu threw the fish back to Seymour, and in no time they found themselves playing a thrilling game of fish tennis. Towards the end of the first set, Pingu tried a different way of playing. He squeezed the fish between his wings and sort of squirted it over the washing line. Seymour bounced the fish back to Pingu. Pingu caught the fish again and again squirted it over the line. Seymour bounced the fish back to Pingu, who caught it and again squirted it, but this time the fish didn't fly over the washing line. It flopped onto the line and just sort of hung there. Pingu and Seymour were furious. Seymour leapt up and down, but he just couldn't reach that fish, and he got crosser and crosser. Pingu tried climbing the pole at the end of the line. But then he remembered that penguins can't climb, so he had to slide back to the bottom of the pole. But now he had a better idea. He hurried back to his own house. Where he found his own special pair of Antarctic stilts. Then he leapt up onto them. In no time, Pingu was back at the washing line. High up now, he was able to ping the fish off the line. And Seymour was able to catch it. Time for lunch, he thought. Instantly, the floppy fish became their meal. And together, Pingu and Seymour tucked into their lunch. Soon they were full and ready again for fun and games. And what could be more fun for a young penguin than spending all afternoon marching about Antarctica on his Antarctic stilts? And what could be more fun for a baby seal than spending all afternoon chasing a penguin on stilts?